The words hung in the air between them like smoke from a dying fire, harsh and bitter, in the quiet of the Nebraska farmhouse kitchen. Dan Whitmore, looked across the simple wooden table at his wife of 3 months, watching as Catherine's green eyes blazed with the defiance that had first caught his attention at the church social back in Independence, Missouri. "I only married you for your land," she said again, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands as she set down her coffee cup with deliberate precision. "I want you to know that. I want there to be no illusions between us about what this arrangement really is." Dan was a man of 42 years, weathered by 2 decades of working the soil under the vast Nebraska sky. His hands were permanently stained with earth, his face lined by sun and wind, his back bent slightly from years of following a plow. He had never expected to marry, had long since accepted that his life would be spent alone on the 640 acres he had claimed and proved up during the homestead rush of the 1870s. Then Catherine Morrison had arrived in town with her father, a failed merchant looking for a fresh start on the frontier. She was 28, educated and beautiful in a way that seemed out of place among the rough settlements of the Nebraska Territory. More importantly, she was unmarried and facing the prospect of spinsterhood in a world that offered few options for women without husbands or family to support them. The arrangement had been proposed by her father, a man desperate to secure his daughter's future before his own failing health took him. Dan needed a wife to help manage his successful farm and perhaps bear children to inherit his land. Catherine needed security and protection in a world that was unforgiving to women alone. It was a practical solution to mutual problems. Nothing more. "I know," Dan said quietly, reaching for the butter to spread on his morning biscuit. His voice carried no hurt, no surprise, no anger at her brutal honesty. "I figured as much from the beginning. Your father made it plain enough when he approached me." Catherine had expected anger, perhaps wounded pride, certainly some reaction to her deliberately cruel words. Instead, Dan's calm acceptance threw her off balance. She had spoken out of frustration and fear, testing the boundaries of their strange relationship, trying to provoke some emotion from the quiet man who had become her husband. "Doesn't that bother you?" she pressed, leaning forward across the table. "Knowing that your wife feels nothing for you except gratitude for the roof over her head and the food on her plate." Dan took a thoughtful bite of his biscuit, chewing slowly as he considered her question. Through the kitchen window, he could see the sun rising over the cornfields that stretched to the horizon, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink that never failed to move him. This land was his life, his purpose, his legacy. If Catherine had married him for it, then she had married him for the thing he valued most in the world. "Can't say it bothers me much," he replied finally, his voice carrying the measured cadence of a man who thought before he spoke. "You're honest about it, which is more than some folks manage. And you're here, which is what matters for the work that needs doing." Catherine stared at him, frustrated by his unshakable calm. In the 3 months since their wedding, she had tried repeatedly to penetrate the wall of quiet contentment that seemed to surround him. He was kind to her, respectful and considerate of her needs, but he remained as much a mystery to her as the day they had exchanged vows in the small church in Independence. "The work," she repeated, her voice sharp with sarcasm. "Yes, I suppose that's all that matters to you, the endless, back-breaking work of farming this God-forsaken prairie." Dan looked at her then, really looked at her, taking in the fine features that spoke of good breeding, the hands that had never known calluses before coming to his farm, the dress that was well made but practical rather than fashionable. She was beautiful, but it was a beauty that seemed at odds with her surroundings, like a rose trying to bloom in rocky soil. "Catherine," he said gently, "what is it you're really trying to say? Because if there's something troubling you, something you need, I'd rather you speak plain about it than dance around it with hurtful words. The gentleness in his voice was almost her undoing. She had armed herself with cruelty, expecting battle, but his patient kindness left her defenseless. For a moment, her composure cracked, and he caught a glimpse of the fear and loneliness she worked so hard to hide. "I don't know how to be a farmer's wife," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know how to tend chickens or milk cows or preserve vegetables. I can't even make decent bread. Back home we had servants for such things. I feel useless here, like I'm taking up space without contributing anything of value." Dan stood and walked to the stove, where a fresh loaf of bread sat cooling on a wooden rack. It was dense and slightly lopsided, the product of Catherine's latest attempt at mastering the basics of frontier cooking. He cut 2 thick slices, spread them with butter and honey, and placed one in front of her. "This bread tastes just fine to me," he said, taking a bite of his own slice. "Maybe it's not as pretty as what the baker in town makes, but it fills the belly, and it was made by your hands. That makes it valuable." Catherine looked down at the bread, seeing all its imperfections, the uneven texture that spoke of her inexperience. "You're just being kind." "I'm being honest," Dan corrected. "Same as you were about marrying me for the land. We both got something we needed from this arrangement, Catherine. You got security and I got a partner. Partners don't have to love each other to work well together." The word love hung between them, unspoken but present nonetheless. Neither had mentioned it during their brief courtship or in the months since their wedding. It was not part of their practical arrangement, not something either had expected or demanded from the other. "Is that enough for you?" Catherine asked, genuinely curious about this man who seemed so content with so little. "A marriage without love, without passion, without the things people write songs and poems about?" Dan finished his bread and stood to clear the table, his movements efficient and unhurried. "Catherine, I've seen what people call love. I've watched it make fools of good men and drive sensible women to ruin. What we have is better than that. We have honesty, respect, and common purpose. That's a foundation that won't crumble at the first sign of trouble." As he moved around the kitchen, cleaning up from breakfast with the practiced ease of a man long accustomed to caring for himself, Catherine found herself watching him with new eyes. There was something deeply attractive about his competence, his unshakable calm, his acceptance of life as it was rather than as he might wish it to be. "Dan," she said as he prepared to head out to the fields, "what if I told you I wanted to really learn how to be the kind of wife this place needs?" He paused at the door, his hand on the worn wooden handle, and turned to look at her. "I'd say we start with the chickens. They're less particular than the cows, and they don't kick when you make mistakes." Despite herself, Catherine smiled. It was a small smile, but it was the first genuine expression of warmth she had shown him since their wedding day. "All right then, chickens it is." As Dan headed out to begin his day's work, Catherine remained at the table, staring out at the vast expanse of prairie that was now her home. She had married him for his land, that much was true, but sitting there in the morning light, eating bread that she had made with her own inexperienced hands, she began to wonder if perhaps she might have gotten more than she had bargained for. 3 months after Catherine's harsh declaration about her motives for marriage, the Whitmore farmhouse had begun to show signs of her growing competence and gradual acceptance of her new life. The chickens that had once terrified her with their aggressive pecking and unpredictable movements now came running when they heard her voice, recognizing her as the source of their daily grain and fresh water. Catherine stood in the henhouse at dawn, gathering eggs with the confidence that came from weeks of practice. Her hands, once soft and pale from a life of leisure, now bore the small calluses and scratches that marked a working woman. She wore a simple dress of sturdy cotton, covered by an apron that showed the stains of honest labor. "Good morning, ladies," she murmured to the hens as she worked. a habit she had developed during the lonely hours of learning her new responsibilities. "I hope you've been productive overnight." The prize hen, a Rhode Island red that Catherine had named Victoria for, her regal bearing and fierce independence, regarded her with one bright eye before settling more firmly on her nest. This was their daily negotiation, a battle of wills that Catherine had learned to win through patience rather than force. "Come now, Victoria," Catherine coaxed, offering a handful of corn. "We both know you're not actually broody. You're just being difficult because you can be." As if understanding the accusation, Victoria huffed with indignation but stepped off her nest, allowing Catherine to retrieve the large brown egg beneath. It was a small victory, but one that filled Catherine with a satisfaction she had never experienced in her previous life of idle comfort. When she emerged from the henhouse with her basket of eggs, Catherine found Dan waiting by the barn, ready to begin the morning milking. He had offered to teach her this skill as well, but the cows still intimidated her with their size and seemingly unpredictable temperaments. "How many today?" Dan asked, nodding toward her basket. 14, Catherine replied with pride. "Victoria finally gave up her egg without making me beg for it." Dan smiled at the note of accomplishment in her voice. Over the past months, he had watched Catherine transform from a reluctant city woman into someone who was beginning to find her place on the farm. The change was subtle but unmistakable, visible in the way she moved with growing confidence. A way she spoke about her chickens and her garden with possessive pride. "That's a good count," he said. "Mrs. Henderson in town has been asking if we have eggs to spare. Seems her hens have gone off laying." Catherine felt a flush of pleasure at the idea that her work might have value beyond their own household. "How much would she pay for them?" "Enough to make it worth the trip," Dan replied. "If you're interested in starting a little business with your eggs." The suggestion surprised Catherine. In her father's world, business was men's work, and women were expected to focus on domestic duties that brought no income. The idea that her chickens might generate actual money was both thrilling and daunting. "I'd like that," she said, then paused. "Dan, may I ask you something?" "Of course. Why do you do that? Why do you always frame things as if I have a choice? As if my opinion matters in decisions about the farm?" Dan considered her question as he prepared the milking equipment, his movements automatic from years of practice. "Because your opinion does matter, Catherine. This is your home now, your life. If you're going to be happy here, you need to have a say in how things are run." "But the land is yours," Catherine pointed out. "I married you for it, remember. That makes me dependent on your generosity." "The land was mine," Dan corrected gently. "Now it's ours. The day we said our vows, everything I owned became half yours by law. You're not dependent on my generosity, Catherine. You're my partner." The word partner had taken on new meaning over the months of their marriage. What had started as a practical arrangement was evolving into something deeper, though neither spoke directly about the change. They had fallen into comfortable routines, sharing the work and the decisions, finding pleasure in small accomplishments, and mutual respect. "I've been thinking," Catherine said as they walked toward the house for breakfast, "about what you said that first morning, about us being partners who don't need to love each other to work well together." Dan glanced at her, noting something different in her tone. "What about it?" "I think you may have been wrong about the love part." Dan stopped walking, his heart suddenly beating faster at the implication of her words. "Wrong how?" Catherine set down her basket of eggs and turned to face him fully, her green eyes serious but no longer guarded. "I think maybe love doesn't always look the way people expect it to. Maybe sometimes it looks like teaching someone to gather eggs without getting pecked. Maybe it looks like eating imperfect bread and calling it good. Maybe it looks like sharing decisions and treating someone as an equal when you don't have to." She Paused, gathering courage for words that would change everything between them. "I married you for your land, Dan. That's true, but I stayed for you. I stayed because somewhere along the way, between the chickens and the bread and the quiet conversations over coffee, I realized that I had found something I didn't even know I was looking for." Dan felt his throat tighten with emotion he had kept carefully controlled for months. "And what was that?" "Home," Catherine said simply. "Not just a place to live, but a real home, with a man who sees me as I am and helps me become who I want to be." Dan reached out and took her hands in his, noting the calluses and small scars that marked her transformation from lady to farm wife. "Catherine, I need to tell you something too. That first morning, when you said you married me for the land, I told you it didn't bother me. That was only half true." "What was the other half?" "The other half was hope," Dan admitted. "Hope that maybe, if I was patient enough and kind enough, you might come to care for the man as much as you valued the land." Catherine smiled, the radiant expression transforming her face and making Dan's heart skip. "Well then, I'd say your patience paid off, wouldn't you?" Before Dan could respond, she stood on her tiptoes and kissed him, a gentle, tentative gesture that spoke of new beginnings and possibilities neither had dared to imagine. When they broke apart, both were smiling. "So," Dan said, his voice slightly husky with emotion, "does this mean you'll let me teach you to milk the cows?" Catherine laughed, the sound carrying across the prairie like music. "Let's not get ahead of ourselves, husband. I'm still working up the courage for that particular challenge." As they walked hand in hand toward the house, carrying eggs that Catherine had gathered and planning a day of shared work on land that belonged to both of them, neither could have imagined how much their lives would change. The practical arrangement that had brought them together was blossoming into something deeper, richer, and more satisfying than either had thought possible. Subscribe to help us keep bringing you these incredible stories of love found in unexpected places. 1 year after Catherine's brutal honesty about her marriage motives, the Whitmore farm had become one of the most prosperous in the county. The fields stretched green and gold under the autumn sun, heavy with corn that would soon be ready for harvest. The chicken operation that had started as Catherine's tentative first step into farm life now supplied eggs to half the town, generating income that had allowed them to expand their livestock and improve their equipment. Catherine stood at the kitchen window, watching Dan work with the new hired hand they had been able to afford thanks to their increased prosperity. She wore a blue dress she had sewn herself, practical but pretty, and her hair was pinned back in a style that was both neat and becoming. The transformation from reluctant city bride to confident farm wife was complete, but more importantly, the transformation from practical partners to devoted couple had deepened with each passing season. "Mrs. Whitmore," called a voice from the front yard, "you have visitors." Catherine wiped her hands on her apron and went to the door, surprised to see a fine carriage pulling up to their modest farmhouse. The vehicle was out of place in their rural setting, speaking of wealth and city sophistication that she had once known but no longer missed. From the carriage stepped a well-dressed woman of middle age, followed by a younger man in an expensive suit. Catherine recognized them immediately, despite the years that had passed since she had seen them. Mrs. Eleanor Hartwick had been one of her mother's closest friends in Independence, and the young man was her son Robert, who had once paid Catherine considerable attention before her father's business failures had made her an unsuitable match. "Catherine, my dear," Mrs. Hartwick called out, her voice carrying the cultured tones of society. "How wonderful to see you again, though I must say I hardly recognized you." Catherine felt a familiar tightness in her chest, the old insecurity about her changed circumstances threatening to surface. But then she reminded herself of who she was now, what she had accomplished, and the love she had found in this unlikely place. "Mrs. Hartwick," "Robert," she said with genuine warmth. "What? A surprise? Please come in, I'll put on some coffee." As they settled around the kitchen table, Catherine noticed how her former acquaintances looked around the simple room with barely concealed condescension. The fine china she had brought from her father's house was nowhere in evidence, replaced by sturdy crockery suitable for daily use. The furniture was handmade but comfortable, the decorations few but meaningful. "Catherine, dear," Mrs. Hartwick began, her voice carrying false sympathy, "when we heard about your father's death and your circumstances, we were quite concerned. Robert and I were traveling through on business, and we simply had to stop and see how you were managing." "I'm managing very well, thank you," Catherine replied, pouring coffee into cups that she had no reason to be ashamed of. "Dan and I have built a good life here." Robert leaned forward, his expression serious and somewhat patronizing. "Catherine, I want you to know that despite everything that happened between our families, I still care about your welfare. If you're unhappy here, if this frontier life has proven too difficult, there might be options available to you." Catherine felt a flash of her old temper, but she kept her voice steady. "What kind of options, Robert?" "Well," he said, glancing meaningfully at his mother, "my own situation has changed considerably since we last spoke. I've come into a substantial inheritance, and I'm no longer bound by the financial considerations that once complicated our relationship." The implication hung in the air like smoke from a poorly tended fire. Mrs. Hartwick nodded encouragingly, clearly seeing herself as a benefactor rescuing a dear friend's daughter from unfortunate circumstances. "Robert is trying to say, dear," Mrs. Hartwick clarified, "that he would be willing to overlook your current marriage and offer you a chance to return to the life you were meant for. A divorce could be arranged discreetly, and you could resume your proper place in society." Catherine stared at them both, hardly believing what she was hearing. The life she was meant for had been one of idle dependence, of ornamental existence as decoration in someone else's world. These people who claimed to care about her welfare were essentially suggesting that she abandoned the home she had built, the man she had come to love, and the independence she had fought so hard to achieve. "My proper place," Catherine repeated, slowly, "is here with my husband on our farm." Robert's expression showed genuine confusion. "Catherine, surely you can't prefer this rustic existence to what I'm offering. You could have servants again, fine clothes, a place in society. You could live as a lady again instead of—" he gestured around the simple kitchen, "instead of this." Before Catherine could respond, the kitchen door opened and Dan entered, his work clothes dusty from the fields, but his presence immediately filling the room with quiet authority. He had heard voices and come to see who was visiting, not from jealousy or suspicion, but from the natural curiosity of a host. "Dan," Catherine said, rising to meet him, "these are some old friends from Independence, Mrs. Hartwick and her son Robert." Dan nodded politely to the visitors, but Catherine could see him taking in their expensive clothes, their superior expressions, the way they looked at him as if he were a curiosity rather than the master of his own domain. "Pleased to meet you," Dan said simply. "Any friends of Catherine's are welcome here." Robert stood, perhaps trying to assert some advantage through height, but Dan's solid presence and natural confidence made the gesture seem petty rather than impressive. "Mr. Whitmore," Robert said with condescending politeness, "I was just explaining to Catherine that her options aren't as limited as she might think. There are people who care about her welfare and would be happy to help her return to a more suitable situation." Dan looked at Catherine, and she saw understanding pass between them. He knew exactly what was being offered and what it implied about their life together, but rather than anger, she saw only quiet amusement in his eyes. "Well now," Dan said mildly, "that's certainly generous of you. Catherine, what do you think?" About that, Catherine moved to stand beside her husband, taking his work-roughened hand in hers without any shame or hesitation. "I think, Robert, that you don't understand what a suitable situation actually looks like." She gestured around the kitchen, her voice growing stronger with each word. "This is a home where I'm valued for my contributions, not my ornamental value. This is a place where my opinions matter, where my work has meaning, where I'm a partner, rather than a decoration." She looked directly at Robert, seeing him clearly for perhaps the first time. "You're offering me the chance to be a pretty, useless thing again, dependent on someone else's generosity and goodwill. I'm declining that." "Generous offer?" Mrs. Hartwick looked genuinely shocked. "Catherine, dear, surely you're not thinking clearly. This man may be adequate for frontier life, but you were raised for so much more." "You're right," Catherine agreed. "I was raised for more. I was raised to be ornamental and dependent, but I've learned to be useful and independent. I've learned to build something with my own hands, to contribute to something larger than myself, to be loved for who I am rather than what I represent." Dan squeezed her hand gently, his quiet pride in her evident to everyone in the room. "I think," he said calmly, "Catherine's made her position pretty clear." Robert's face flushed with embarrassment and frustrated pride. "Catherine, you're making a mistake. This rustic infatuation won't last. When the novelty wears off, you'll remember what you've given up. What I've given up," Catherine said firmly, "is a life of beautiful meaninglessness. What I've gained is a marriage built on mutual respect, shared work, and real love. I know which has more lasting value." As the visitors prepared to leave, their mission clearly unsuccessful, Mrs. Hartwick made one last attempt. "Catherine, if you ever change your mind, if you ever realize that this life isn't what you truly want, you know how to reach us." "I appreciate your concern," Catherine replied politely, "but I already have everything I truly want." After the carriage disappeared down the dusty road, Catherine and Dan stood together on their front porch, watching the sun set over their fields. The corn rustled in the evening breeze, and in the distance they could hear the contented sounds of their livestock settling for the night. "Any regrets?" Dan asked quietly, echoing a question they had asked each other many times over the months of their marriage. Catherine leaned against his solid shoulder, feeling the peace that came from being exactly where she belonged. "Just one." Dan tensed slightly. "What's that?" "I regret that it took me so long to realize that marrying you for your land was the best decision I ever made," Catherine said with a smile in her voice, "because it led me to everything else worth having." Dan wrapped his arms around his wife, holding her close as the first stars appeared in the vast Nebraska sky. "Well then," he said contentedly, "I'd say we both got exactly what we needed, wouldn't you?" "Yes," Catherine agreed, thinking of the long journey from practical arrangement to deep love, from reluctant partnership to joyful marriage. "I believe we did." As they stood together in the gathering darkness, surrounded by the fruits of their shared labor and the home they had built together, both understood that sometimes the best things in life came disguised as practical necessities. Catherine had married Dan for his land, but she had found so much more: purpose, partnership, and a love that grew stronger with each shared sunrise over their corner of the endless prairie. Please subscribe to help us continue sharing these stories that remind us love can bloom in the most unexpected places.